So let me go ahead and begin. Um, it's a pleasure again to have you all join us, so welcome. I wanted to start off with a brief overview on where we are in terms of the focus on ocean in the global agenda. My name is Janine Felsen. I am a research fellow with the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. Prior to joining, I worked for 20 years with the government of Belize, largely multilateral diplomacy and on ocean-related issues, as well as climate. So this is an area that is of tremendous interest to me. And it's great to be able to feature two speakers from this area who've been involved in improving the science, improving policy, and looking at positive ways forward to drive the science policy interface. It's fitting for this World Ocean Day, where the focus is on life and livelihoods. This UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for a transformation of the human relationship with nature, and that of course includes oceans. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and the pertinent seas and pay my respects to the elders, my own elders, past and present. I think it's fitting that we do so in the fact that Indigenous peoples have themselves long stewarded oceans, seas, and the life that these great bodies of waters sustain. Appropriately, World Oceans Day also brings focus to the integral role of the ocean to human and planetary sustainability. So since we adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which brought focus attention to the life below water, as well as the Paris Agreement, which acknowledged the essential role of the ocean as a climate regulator, there has been a surge of political momentum to address ocean-related issues in an integrated manner. And perhaps I'm speaking more from a global policy, because there's no question that there have been a lot of very engaged, active NGOs and others in the ocean space. But what has spurred that momentum is not only, I think, the political recognition of the role that the ocean can play for achieving sustainable development, as well as to address climate change, but alongside that, the recognition is a stark reality of the dire state of the ocean. Right after adopting the agenda, the 2030 agenda, we had the first World Ocean Assessment, which was quite frankly a red flag that the carrying capacity of the ocean was at or near capacity. That was one of its headline messages. And it underscored the urgency to act to protect the ocean. We then had, following that, the first UN Ocean Conference, which brought together a range of stakeholders, not only political leaders, but representatives from different sectors, scientists and fisher folks. And that itself served as a call to action and a signal of an all-hands-on-deck approach to the ocean. On the heels of that conference, and we had other initiatives, and I'm drawing attention to these because sometimes we miss the whole picture of all this action that's occurring. We had the launch of negotiation for a new high seas treaty on marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which in a sense would close the loop potentially for ocean governance and deal with some of the fragmentation that we see in ocean space. And then we had, led by Fiji, an ocean action pathway in the climate conference. And I think it was the first time that we saw the ocean agenda and the climate agenda coming together in that climate space, which was quite significant. But then right after, of course, we had the IPCC report on ocean and the cryosphere and a changing climate. And I think that reinforced the importance of redirecting our focus away from the siloed approaches that we tend to normally have in those large political spaces. 2020 was supposed to be the super year of the ocean. That's before COVID took center stage. And why was it going to be the super year? Well, we were going to hopefully conclude or move towards concluding that new new high seas treaty. I'm so sorry, I will use acronyms. We call it BBNJ treaty. it was going to be the year that we saw the second convening of the UN Ocean Conference, which was going to look at science and technology to support advancing the goals of the Sustainable Development Agenda for life below water. And of course, we were anxiously working towards the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So there have been delays, and rightly so, because of the situation that we're all facing with the pandemic. But I wouldn't say that we've lost momentum. Even with the COVID and all these delays, we've had the decade for ocean science launch, which is very important. And importantly, we've also had the second World Ocean Assessment. We've also seen the activism of leaders from across the globe, representing 30% of the world's exclusive economic zone in the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy, coming forward with bold commitments to achieve 100% sustainable ocean management of areas within national jurisdiction. So today's conversation will bring together two highly regarded ocean experts who will provide us with a context of the state of the ocean and ocean science, and the opportunities for greater interface between science and policy so that we can progress an inclusive, integrated ocean action agenda, and so potentially reset the human relationship with the oceans. We have with us, and I'll give introduction to both of our speakers, Dr. Karen Evans, who's a team leader and principal research scientist with CSIRO, Oceans and Atmosphere, based in Hobart, Tasmania. She leads and is involved in research focused on improving scientific understanding and developing better tools for assessing the state of marine ecosystems and delivering information that can help guide the sustainable management of marine species and ecosystems. Karen's expertise and reputation has seen her contribute to numerous initiatives, working groups, task teams, nationally, internationally, including the United Nations. And what you would not have seen in her bio brief on the MISSI website is that she was one of the lead authors of the chapters in the Second World Ocean Assessment. And she was, I believe, Australia's only member on the group of experts that coordinated that World Ocean Assessment. And I'm happy to see that she will be continuing guiding the work for the third United Nations World Ocean Assessment, and also functioning within the teams contributing to the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. We are also very fortunate to have with us Dr. Joelle Vaiteaki, Associate Professor at the School of Marine Studies for the University of South Pacific. He's also Director for International Ocean Institute Pacific Islands, based at the USP, and is co-chair of the Korea South Pacific Ocean Forum. He's a trained teacher who did his Bachelor of Arts in Education and Masters of Art Studies at USP. He has obtained his PhD in Environment Management and Development from the National Center of Development Studies at ANU, so no stranger to Australia. Apart from teaching, Joelle conducts research in different parts of Fiji and the Pacific Island countries with partners from USP and abroad, and I will say even in the Caribbean, where I hail from, to promote sustainable use and management of marine resources. Dr. Vaiteaki has served as an advisor in the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. So we're really grateful to have both of you here. So I will give the floor or pass the screen to Dr. Evans first, who will walk us through the World Ocean Assessment and with a view to the UN Decade for Ocean Science. And I'll give you a moment to get your presentation up. Dr. Evans?
Thank you, Janine. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy World Oceans Day. Thanks to today's organisers at the Melbourne Sustainability Society Institute for the opportunity to take part in this panel discussion today. As Janine said, my name is Karen Evans and I'm coming to you from CSIRO, Oceans and Atmosphere, which is situated in Nipaluna, Hobart, Lutruwina, Tasmania. And I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land I'm presenting to you from today, the Muwanina people, and recognise elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to briefly talk today about some of the challenges we face in delivering a sustainable future ocean, but also the opportunities we have over the next decade in achieving that future sustainable ocean. So many of you would know that the ocean is central to life on Earth and our economies. It drives the carbon cycle, which sequesters carbon from the atmosphere and provides important carbon for uptake by plankton for photosynthesis that then produces more than 50% of the oxygen we breathe. The ocean regulates temperatures on Earth, as well as regulating our weather and climate, including rainfall on land. And the ocean also acts as a filter, breaking down those nutrients that have run off from the land. It provides our food through fisheries and aquaculture, and some of the medicines that we use are derived from ocean plants and animals. The ocean is our major transport highway for shipping goods around the world. We derive incomes from the ocean through tourism, but particularly in Australia, the ocean is also a special place for most of us, with 85% of all Australians living in coastal regions. We flock to the beach on a sunny day, derive well-being from it, and importantly, to our First Nations people, the ocean is their country. Ocean industries contributed $71.4 billion to the Australian economy in 2015-2016 alone. However, this use of the ocean has and continues to be unsustainable. The United Nations recognised in 1992 at the Rio Conference on the Environment and Development that an improved understanding of the marine environment, the human uses of the marine environment, and the impacts that use was having on the marine environment was needed. In 2002, a process was started to develop a framework for gathering that understanding that culminated in the production of the first global integrated marine assessment in 2016. And although other assessments have been produced that focus on particular issues within the ocean, this assessment constituted the only global assessment of the world's ocean to cover the three pillars of sustainable development. That is the environment, the economy, and society. Recognising that not everyone in the world was going to diligently read the 1,000 pages that were contained within the assessment, a series of technical abstracts that summarise the content of the assessment in relation to three themes were produced. One on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. One on the impacts of climate change and related changes on the ocean, and a third on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In addition, the executive summary from the assessment was also published in the five languages of the UN. As Janine mentioned, a second assessment was released this year in April, and it builds on the first assessment, focusing on change and trends since the first assessment. It also incorporates several improvements on the first and expands consideration of a number of issues in the marine environment. As with the first assessment, it has recognised that not everyone has the time or dedication to read 1,000 pages, so it's important to highlight that the assessment comprises more than just the final output. It has involved 2 series of regional workshops aimed at knowledge transfer and capacity building, multi-stakeholder workshops, web series and webinars, which are all available on the assessment's website. And a series of policy relevant briefs are planned to be released over the next coming year. Although the second assessment does highlight some bright spots where progress towards sustainability is being made. For the large part, it reiterates the findings of the first assessment in that almost all components of the ocean are impacted by climate change and human use. And this is largely because there has been a failure to achieve integrated management of human activities. And this is compounded by our knowledge of the ocean not being sufficient enough to inform decision making. We actually know more about the moon than we do about our ocean. And the knowledge that we do have is not always accessible and available for decision making. Having said that, there is the potential to reverse trends. With appropriate governance, overfish stocks could be rebuilt within 10 years. The implementation of integrated modelling frameworks can support the identification of sustainable use pathways, and targeted efforts in capacity building in the use of marine spatial planning and ecosystem approaches to management can provide the foundations for long-term sustainable use. New and strengthened partnerships for sharing knowledge can unlock the information needed for decision making. So recognising this potential and the urgent need for action, the United Nations has identified 2021 through to 2030 as a decade of ocean science for sustainable development. And this really does provide a framework for actioning the science that's needed to drive us towards sustainability. The core mission of the decade, being coordinated by the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO, the UN body for education, science and culture, is to develop scientific knowledge, build infrastructure and foster partnerships for a sustainable and healthy ocean. In late 2020, the IOC released an implementation plan for the ocean decade that sets out a framework for taking us from the ocean we currently have on the left-hand side of the screen to the ocean that we want on the right-hand side of the screen through a foundation of science that is focused around a series of objectives and actions to deliver to 7 identified societal outcomes. And those societal outcomes include a clean ocean, a healthy and resilient ocean, a productive ocean, a predicted ocean, a safe ocean, an accessible ocean, and an inspiring and engaging ocean. And there are no surprises. The Ocean Decade is focused on delivering outcomes that contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, and that it aligns with the commitments made by Australia's marine science community through their National Marine Science Plan, and the commitments recently made by the Australian Prime Minister, along with 13 other national leaders of countries, as part of the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. Our lives and our economies rely on the ocean, and we can only have a profitable future and a comfortable future if we take care of our ocean and ensure its future health and sustainability. Achieving the societal outcomes set under the Ocean Decade will require considerable effort. It will require large-scale innovations and the development of scalable and deployable solutions that are accessible by all. It will require overcoming discipline and sectoral divides to ensure that pathways forward and solutions are truly integrative and consider all components of the ocean. And it will require overcoming data and information provision divides so that all information is available and accessible to all, regardless of where we are on the planet. It will also require building bridges that close traditional divides, whether that be between various components of society or between knowledge systems. And it will require building knowledge exchange and brokering capacity so that information users are connected to the information they need. And finally, it will require the involvement of us all to not only develop and scale solutions, but also to implement those solutions, including changing past and current behaviours. we were all part of the solutions needed for a future healthy and productive ocean. And I thank you all for listening to me today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Evans, for that very comprehensive overview of the state of the ocean, World Ocean Assessment, the platforms that we can engage on, as you mentioned, the challenges and the opportunities to really move towards that future healthy ocean, which I think is really important for us to focus on. I forgot to mention to our audience that you are very welcome to raise any question to our speakers by using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen. And let me pause for a little to see if there were any questions on clarification on Dr. Evans's presentation. If not, we'll continue the conversation right after we hear from Professor Fetiaki. And this will give me an opportunity also to work the Q&A function. Good. So I think that was very clear, Dr. Evans. And now I will start up a conversation with Professor Fetiaki, who has, as I mentioned, a wealth of experience and who has conducted a lot of research supporting policymakers addressing the sustainable use and management of marine resources. So coming from a country that also finds its alliance with the small island developing states, I've always been impressed by the fact that small island developing states are custodians of some 30% of the world's ocean and marine space, which is very significant considering the size of our countries, of many of the countries. I wanted you to share with the audience your experience, your perspective, even reaction to what you just heard from Dr. Evans regarding the state of the ocean and how we might rebalance that relationship with the ocean using the perspective of the Pacific small island developing states. What are some of the critical areas of concern that you might also want to highlight? And of course, we know very well the challenges that come about because of climate change, but there are other issues that are equally putting pressure on marine resources in many of the small island developing states in the Pacific. And given your background, in science and policy, how do you see these interacting, and what are some of the potential barriers or opportunities to overcome those? So it's a very wide range of questions, but really I want to dive into your perspective from the region that you come from and the work that you've been doing to address that very issue of sustainable use management of marine resources in the Pacific Islands. Professor Fetiaki?
Thank you very much. And thanks, Dr. Evans, for having introduced the global as well as the situation in the largest island in the Pacific. That gives me the basis on which to now try and take us to the small island, Pacific small island developing states. And as we all know, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea has transformed the thinking in the Pacific about that very status of being small island developing states. The argument being put forth that maybe we deserve to be referred to as large ocean island states because that more effectively describes the responsibilities and the challenges relating to the situation where the small islands have responsibility for the sustainable use and management of huge expanse of ocean. The vast expansion of sovereign territory brought about by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea has certainly brought additional responsibilities to the small island developing states. One of the examples, of course, is the terms under which they have to prepare for the natural hazards that we've heard from Dr. Evans has become a lot more regular in recent times because of the consequence of climate change. I think while it's still vivid in our memory, over the last 6 years, the Pacific Island, small island developing states have lived through 5 Category 5 storms. And it's a process that has forced them to continually try and recover from the consequences of the devastation caused by those natural hazards. So while the Pacific Island states are doing their utmost to protect their people and their territories from devastating economically draining natural hazards like storms and floods and droughts, we have not that are threatening the food sources. We have not been very successful in convincing the international community to do their part in supporting the efforts that are being undertaken in the small island developing countries in the Pacific. So while the new wealth associated with new developments such as, or the new wealth potential from the deep seabed mining, renewable energy sourced from the combined EEZ area of over 30 million square kilometers is largely untapped. The burden that it places on the Pacific SIDS are quite overwhelming, basically. As I said earlier, in relation to the hazards, Pacific Island states are continually in the process of recovering from natural hazards or from all kinds of impacts relating to the state of the ocean that we now are living with. So the responsibility is to for Pacific Island states is to effectively control and sustainably manage the marine resources within their care, and that, as I've been saying, is a huge burden on these small economies, small countries. Most of them don't even have coast guards or navies. So you talk about a very unique situation. The end result, unfortunately, is that we still have illegal, unregulated, and unrecorded and unregulated fishing remaining one of the huge challenges faced in the Pacific Island, small island developing states. These IUU activities, they rob these already weak economies and relatively poor countries of the fair return from the use of their resources. In addition, we have growing population pressure and the consequent degradation and pollution of sensitive coastal environments, increasing emphasis on economic development, greater stress on traditional fisheries of reefs, in lagoons and inland water bodies, the lucrative opportunities to give distant water fishing nations access to the EEZ waters of the countries, dwindling resources, and the development of new technology and new developments, such as I had mentioned earlier, the interest in deep seabed mining. These all require capacity and resources, whether it is human resources or financial. So you can already see the kind of pressures that Pacific Island countries are facing as a result of this combination of factors that are experienced where they are. So while the developments have led to an unprecedented expansion of activities in all aspects of the marine environment, the sustainable management of these resources in my view, have been undertaken largely as a reaction or as reactions to the dwindling returns and sometimes to try and settle conflicts. This is where the challenge on the science and the capacity, or the lack of science and capacity for Pacific Island states is most profound. And at the moment, I suppose out of necessity, all the Pacific Island states have set up regional institutions, regional organizations that are set up to assist the countries in the delivery of their responsibilities and their obligations. Some of these regional bodies include the Pacific Islands Forum, where our political leaders have their discussions on the options that the region can take. Then we have the Pacific Community, which is a technical organization that covers most of the areas relating to development. And then you have the Pacific Regional Environment Program, which is mandated to look after environment management and sustainable development. And the Pacific Islands Forum Fisheries Agency, which looks after the sustainable development and use of the region's largely offshore fisheries, predominantly tuna and tuna-related fisheries. So some of these regional organizations are then mandated to assist the Pacific Island countries in the provision of the science, also even in the advice on policies, so that the small island developing states, which of course have limitations on their human capacity, can fulfill their obligations. One only has to look at the regional agreements that have been forged and agreed to in the Pacific Island countries to see how extensive the influence of these regional organizations and bodies have become for the Pacific. Just to give maybe 3 examples, the SPC, the Pacific Community, provides technical advice on social, economic, cultural development. And in most of the cases, these regional organizations also help in the securing of funds to pay for the interventions that the countries want to see done. SPREP is mandated to assist in providing technical assistance and funding in the areas of environment management and sustainable development, and it covers the ocean, the atmosphere, and the land. The Forum Fisheries Agency looks after the management of the tuna resources, and this often has been cited as a very successful organization in terms of how well it has managed the tuna resources of the region, given the challenges that I had already mentioned. The FFA is also one of the effective partners of the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, which is the regional fisheries management organization for a big part of the region where the Pacific Island developing states are. And last of the organizations that I would like to mention in particular is, of course, the institution that I work with, the University of the South Pacific, which has campuses in 11 of its member countries, with Fiji having more than 3 campuses. So basically, the University of the South Pacific is mandated to provide tertiary education, building capacity at that high level, conduct research and consultancy to assist the member countries. All the regional bodies in the Pacific recognize the challenge relating to human resources, and a lot of them regard it as a priority. And it is therefore a pleasure to note that at the moment, I suppose tied to the ocean panel that has been formed by the 14 countries that I will hopefully talk about later in the discussion. There's a partnership between Norway and the Pacific Island countries on a program, a scholarship program. It's called the Norway Pacific Ocean and Climate Scholarship, where in the next 4 years, Norway has funded 24 scholarships, PhD scholarships for Pacific Islanders. Hopefully, all of the regional countries can participate in that process, and that's the hope, to try and build capacity at that high level. I want to just finish my this introductory discussion by saying that the situation in the Pacific illustrates that we cannot continue with business as we have been doing up until now, that we must now rethink ocean policy, management options, and action. I know through the UNCED process, we have been going on discussing matters over decades. I think the timing is now important, it's now critical, that action needs to be taken, and I'm grateful to the ocean panel that has been formed by 12 member countries for taking the leadership in this desire to make positive change, and not just have it in terms of documentation, but to actually take action and then demonstrate through what comes out the reasons, the rationale why this kind of intervention should now be given emphasis. The advice from the ocean panel is that we now need to adopt an integrated management approach that addresses equally the aspirations of protecting the ocean and its resources, of ensuring sustainable production, and of course of maintaining the prosperity right across the society. And in terms of very concrete objectives, I think there are 5, and I'd like to just mention those in case we can have time later to go into the details. Very much tied to what Dr. Evans has presented earlier in terms of the situation globally and in Australia. There is the need to collect data to be the basis of policy decision making. And that, of course, is a challenge for the region. We talk about the management of tuna working well, but with tuna, you're talking about limited number of species. In the nearshore areas, you're talking about multiple species. So how do you determine the total allowable catch for each and every one of those species? Those are the kinds of challenges that we now have to address. But again, I'm hopeful that with the kind of partnership that we are forging through the ocean panel, that this kind of challenge can be better addressed. So we now need to invest more in terms of data gathering devices to ensure that we know and have the best ideas possible about the state of the ocean and habitats, and how they can be sustained for the future. Secondly, the need to transit to more integrated marine spatial planning. I think this is now being done in different parts of the world, but we now need to put it up to maybe the level of regions, of commission areas, so that we can also ensure that the integration of all of the sectors observed at that higher, wider level scale. The third recommendation is for sustainable ocean investment. Of course, for all of the interventions, we need investments, and that for small island developing states often is a challenge. They don't really need much, but it's that little that they need that is often also difficult to secure. So a lot of the funding providers do have their processes, and often this is a challenge for small island developing states and the communities to adhere to and to follow. So in a lot of the cases, the funding is then sourced through a third party, which is not the ideal for most of the countries, and of course the region. We need to limit plastic pollution. I'm glad to report that a number of Pacific Island countries have banned the use of plastic. So they are making the difficult decisions because they know of the consequences of doing nothing. Then there is the need to adopt holistic accounting techniques. We need to, as I said earlier, to change the way we do business, and we need to now go with what methods for accounting that the science can support. Basically, that is the 5 main recommendations that the Ocean Panel has come up with, and for the Pacific Islands region, these recommendations are the fuel that we need to light the fire and keep it burning stronger. And with those, I yield back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Vetiaki. That's a very rich expose of all the issues that that some of the major issues that what we've heard a lot in the rhetoric. The large ocean states come with large ocean responsibilities, and I think you picked up on several themes that Dr. Evans also touched upon, which is the need for integrated management. And in fact, as Dr. Evans pointed out in her presentation, some of the issues that relate to the pressures that we see in the ocean and in marine spaces is related to the failure of integrated management. And I guess the question is, where do we go towards treating with that integrated management? I think, Dr. Evans, you spoke to modeling frameworks for bringing multiple stakeholders together. I wondered if you might elaborate a little bit about what that could look like. Are there examples that we could look to? And then I'll pose a question to Professor Vetiaki. I know we never have enough time, so I'm definitely going to look at the questions that have been posed and also weave those into our conversation. But over to you, Dr. Evans.
Thank you, Janine. So there are a couple of, streams of approaches for moving towards integrated management. And one of those is around marine spatial planning. So being able to look at our ocean space and recognise all of the stakeholders that are using that ocean space, bringing them together to understand what the needs are for each of those ocean stakeholders, how they operate within the ocean space, where the overlaps are, where there's potentially some conflicts, and recognizing that we can't look at individual sectors or individual industries within the ocean one by one. We actually need to look at them from a holistic frame of view, to better understand just how those users are using the ocean, but also how we can better manage those uses collectively and holistically, rather than looking at them on a one-to-one basis. So that's one stream of looking at how we move towards integration. The other one is, I had I guess a conceptual diagram in my presentation, which basically mapped out all of those different users and how they're interacting with the marine environment, but also the key marine values that we have for our marine environment. So what's important to us, whether that be threatened and endangered and protected species, whether it be species that are commercially harvested, whether it be key habitats that are important for those commercial species, particularly those early life stages. And we can actually put those into a modelling framework so that we can run scenarios that basically allow us to test how the system will respond to those various users of the ocean, but also how it might respond to, say, for example, fisheries extracting particular species from the system, or how the system might respond to, say, a port being developed in a particular area, and where those key, I guess, pinch points might occur. And we can run those scenarios in different ways, and that allows us to better understand the kind of frameworks that we need to put in place to ensure that our management is integrated and it looks across the whole system rather than just individual components of the system. So I hope that provides a bit of an idea of how we might move towards integrated management. Janine?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, it does. And I did want to pick up on that idea of involvement of stakeholders, and I'll probably kick this over to Professor Vetiaki about this idea of how do we actually bring the stakeholders together, when oftentimes when in certain planning processes we have certain different types of power dynamics at play. What is the type of space that you envision for that type of stakeholder exchange? And also ensuring that the voices are being heard. There have been some probably very preliminary studies on different ways in which we can generate more collaboration and coordination. That might be useful to hear from you, from your own experience, Professor Vetiaki, working in the Pacific across different institutions. What do you see as a good way of ensuring that when we're talking about and engaging, we're being inclusive and we're allowing for there to be sort of a level playing field for users of different political clout or economic leverage to engage?
Thank you very much. I'm going to say what I will say with the realization that yes, integration is really difficult. One of the frustrations that we often witness is when, say, different ministries of government, they even pursue activities that sometimes are contradictory. Just to give you an example, Fisheries might be interested in promoting sustainable development of fisheries, or the use of fisheries, but then perhaps say the Ministry of Women in trying to engage the involvement of women and to bring about gender balance in the participation in economic activities. They then would offer assistance and things that basically contradicts the effort of another section of government. So I suppose maybe now is the time to take integration to governance and to ensure that the decision-making bodies actually are made up of these different areas of responsibility, but they come under one umbrella. It's not an option not to integrate. It is part of what that whole thing, whatever we want to call it, becomes. So that, I think, would be the way to go, is to ensure that it's not just in the policies, but actually that the institutional structures maybe need to be addressed. I just want to say that maybe there is hope in that kind of thing, given the experience of the conference, the Ocean Conference. You know, a lot of us have attended a lot of meetings, but that was one occasion where different stakeholders were comfortable in working together. They brought joint commitments that they then announced to the international community, and I think maybe that's the kind of approach that now needs to be mainstreamed.
Thank you very much for switching out to the global stage, because in fact we can speak about integrated management at different scales and different levels. Certainly at the national and then regional, as you mentioned, Professor Vaitiaki, with the Pacific having multiple institutions that are working on different areas. So there's that challenge of integrated governance at a global level. And I wonder if I can have your reflections on those challenges, or you know, do we need to move to integrated governance? We have this whole new treaty that's being negotiated on marine biodiversity for areas beyond national jurisdiction. And one of the biggest challenges has been to determine how do we deal with the multiple actors, and I'm speaking more in terms of institutions in the international space, working in ABNJ with different types of competence. How do we work to ensure that we're going to achieve the goal of this sustainable use, sustainable management and conservation of marine biological diversity? So just your perspectives, both of you, on do we need integrated ocean governance at the global scale? And what are your views on how science might interface in that level, at that level, sorry. Dr. Evans, I don't know if you want to take a stab at it first.
Sure, Janine. I think, so I guess there's two conceptual processes that need to be considered. Within national jurisdictions, obviously, management of those regions is the responsibility of the nation that is overseeing that region. So, so there is an intersect there between what might be going on at the global level, but what is being implemented at the national level. And then in areas beyond national jurisdictions, which are the common property of the whole globe, the whole world, there is a real need for countries to come together to agree on how best to both use those areas, but also manage the use of those areas, and also consider how those areas can be protected, moving forward to ensure that that interface between national and international areas is considered in a sustainable manner. Those areas sit under what is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and that convention that I think it's well close to 190 countries have signed on to, basically governs all use of the world's oceans, and that really provides the overarching framework underneath which national management can occur, but also regional management, for example, through regional fisheries management organisations can occur. And it also provides that framework within which the treaty that you have mentioned is being considered. It really does dictate how we all come together to both conserve and manage our common oceans. And I guess that's where science can play that real foundational role in those decisions that we make around how do we actually set up management frameworks? How do we set up conservation methods for those common areas? We want our decision-making processes to be made with the best available information, and that's really where the science foundation can come in to inform that decision-making being made on global commons, to ensure that the use of those global commons is done as sustainably as it possibly can. So I'm not sure it actually gets to, do we need an integrated governance framework at the global level? I think we already have some frameworks that we can utilise and build upon as we move forward, particularly in considering how do we sustainably manage, how do we sustainably use, how do we sustainably manage, and how do we conserve those areas.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Evans. Professor Vaitiaki, any reflections? And maybe in this case, you could reflect on the regional governance structures and how that could be integrated more in the global structures to ensure that, you know, we're able to establish partnerships that you've been speaking to, that we're able to ensure that there is that type of knowledge transfer between both. We can ensure that there are opportunities for capacity building, and you know, enhancing the ability of countries like in the small island developing states better deal with the, I don't want to call it the burden, but I know we've spoken about sort of the conservation and sustainable use responsibilities, the greater responsibilities they have had. Or they have as a result of the jurisdiction they hold over wide expanses of the ocean. So, you know, does that an integrated governance at a global level? How can a regional component, or do you see a regional component being integral to the way we envision, you know, management at wider scale? Not just at the national scale.
Well, and I think there are also some examples existing now of regional governance that are integrated, and they take place at that regional level. I mean, to some extent, some of the regional organizations that I was talking about working in the Pacific, they are working in an integrated manner, but just from the names that I had given up, you could already see there was still the separation of fisheries, offshore fisheries from other fisheries. Then there was the body that's responsible for environment generally, but it excludes the fisheries organizations. So perhaps maybe better planning should be done in terms of how those different regional organizations commit to working together to ensure that that the message and the actions are consistent right across the board and up and down. I was also reminded that even for some of the organizations like the fisheries organizations, there are times when even the members don't adhere to, because they are sovereign states. They own the organization, so the members may not fully comply with the regional stand on certain issues, depending on the interests that are at stake, and that's how things get weakened, you know. And I really don't know how else to ensure that that integration is done, maybe except with some kind of enforcement measures that are put in place to ensure that integration is not an option. It has to be observed because it is important. And the point that Dr. Evans mentioned earlier, if the science can be used to strengthen the arguments as to why integration should be according to that scale that is determined or influenced by the science.
Thank you very much, Professor Vaitiaki. I realize that we are, we didn't have enough time. I would like to have spoken a little bit more about the science policy interface and, you know, areas where, you know, we could look at opportunities on the horizon. And maybe I'll just give you a 1 minute each. Opportunities on the horizon where we can strengthen science policy interface. So we do have the UN Decade of Ocean Science, but are there other opportunities that you might see as a way in which we can start moving the discussion of the science and policy closer together so that we can actually aim to get the, what is the tagline from the UN Decade for Ocean Science? The ocean we want. And then we'll end it at that. Thanks so much for answering the questions in the Q&A function itself. So I'll just give one minute each of, you know, what are the opportunities on the horizon that we can seize to get that future we want.
So I think generally there is increasing recognition that that science policy divide really does need to be bridged. And there are efforts that are going on individually around the world to try and facilitate bridging that science policy divide. And that might be through regional organisations such as the ones that Professor Vaitiaki has spoken about, where you have both science but also policymakers working together via those regional organisations. And we're seeing those not just in the Pacific, there are other regions where that's going on. But there's also a growing recognition that we need knowledge brokers, that we need people who understand the science but can interpret that science into formats that decision makers can readily uptake. And there's increasing recognition of research agencies, research institutes, but also governments themselves, that there is a real need for those knowledge brokers so that we can facilitate that information flow from science to policy, but also from policy to science to make sure that our science is delivering the right science to policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Evans. Professor Vaitiaki, any final words?
Yes, I'm excited. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but you know, the high-level panel on sustainable ocean economy is a new entity, and unlike the regional organizations that I've talked to you about, this one is this partnership is between developed countries and developing countries. And I think it's that kind of partnership that we now need more of, because like I was saying, they can complement each other in terms of the capacity to help with the scientific capacity, and of course the funding for the interventions that are required, learning from each other. So in this case, in this particular case, 14 world countries, including Australia and Norway and Japan, Canada, and in the Pacific there are 2 members, Fiji and Palau. It's a wonderful kind of example that I think should be looked at closely, given what they are trying to articulate and then demonstrate. And I suppose it's this kind of intervention that we can then ride on to promote the concept to others around the world.
Thank you very much, Professor Vetiaki, and thank you very much, Dr. Evans, for sharing your views on where we are in the state of the ocean. I think one of the clear narratives that has threaded throughout the discussion is that, we have this vast resource that's integral to lives and livelihoods, as pointed out in the World Oceans Day. And we need to work to ensure that it remains something that is productive, healthy, and we can continue listen all the qualifications, but importantly, we need to make sure that we have a future that has ocean as central to it, because we depend more on the ocean, and now the ocean depends on us to ensure that we are taking the right action to keep it healthy and sustainable. Thanks again to our audience for participating. I know that there were some questions that were posed, and our speakers very kindly responded to them in the Q&A function. So very much appreciated. Let me wish you all a very happy World Ocean Day. And please, everyone has a part to play. It is an all hands on deck approach to protecting the ocean and ensuring that generations after can continue to enjoy it the way we have, but in a sustainable way. So please continue your activism, and thank you once again for being with us.